Could I ask everybody a favor? And I promise we're not going to call on anybody. The format of the discussion today was supposed to be somewhat interactive, where we're going to offer the audience an opportunity to ask us questions during the course of the presentation. And there'll be a roving microphone, but if I could maybe get you guys to sort of fill in down here, I think it'll work better. No pressure. I mean, it's always dangerous to ask that when the doors are still open. People could leave.
He really wants a mosh pit to get going here.
How'd you know?
We're going to be throwing you out there pretty soon. We'll have to catch you.
Thank you. Good morning. I think they're running the Nick Talks simultaneously. I feel like we're Carrot Head and that's Jerry Seinfeld.
Yeah.
You know? Want to start? We're going to close the door, or no? Yes. I want to thank everybody for coming today. The conversation, the Q&A we're about to have is a topic that's becoming increasingly important in the long-term care space. While it's always been sort of there, I think the evolution of how we think about quality is finally starting to emerge and take shape in a very different, in a far more important fashion. As an investor in the industry for 25 years, it's always been important to me, the notion of quality, but I've never really been convinced that anybody or any two people use the word in the same fashion. What we're going to try to do today, before we get going, is actually not provide answers. What we're really hoping is to have an interactive conversation led by these two gentlemen over here, who I will introduce in a minute, but we're hoping that you leave with the ability to formulate some thoughtful questions, how to inquire, how to ask, to become better operators, better investors, if you will, understanding how quality directly and indirectly impacts economic returns in the healthcare space, in our particular case, post-acute and long-term care. My name is Stephen Insoft. I'm the Chief Corporate Development Officer for Omega Healthcare Investors. I was the former president of Aviv REIT. We recently merged with Omega on April 1. Been in the industry for over 25 years as an operator, developer of both assisted living and skilled nursing. I've been an investor now for the past 15 or 16 years. By way of background, Omega owns about 900 predominantly skilled nursing facilities in 42 states around the United States, but we don't operate any of them. We're triple net landlord. So while I know a lot, my knowledge base does not go as far as the two gentlemen on the left who are my experts, if you will, who are going to facilitate this conversation. But I am going to allow David Stordy and Dr. David Gifford to do their own introductions and curriculum vitae.
Great. Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending. I'm Dave Stordy with Mainstreet, and Mainstreet, we're the largest developer of healthcare real estate, specifically in the SNF and transitional care space. We also have an investment competency and a healthcare consulting and solutions and soon-to-be operations competency. It's good to be with you today.
My name is David Gifford. I'm a geriatrician, and I'm the Senior VP for Quality and Regulatory Affairs at the American Healthcare Association at NCAL. We represent about 10,000 of the 15,000 nursing homes and about 3,000 assisted living. And as a Senior VP, as my son said when I got the job and told him my title, he said, "Aren't those the positions they let go when they have financial problems?" And I said, "Yeah, so that's what I do."
I truly appreciate these two guys taking the time and making the effort to talk with all of us today, including myself. The way we're going to try to structure the format is quite simple. It's what I think NIC calls sort of a moderated Q&A. We, to no surprise to you, prepared a number of questions that I'm going to direct at each one of these guys individually. The other might answer. It's not intended to be a debate, but it could lead to debate. And we've got about 7 or 8 of these questions, and they all sort of try to answer the following 3 questions, because NIC likes to keep us on topic and wants to make sure the attendees, in fairness to all of you, are spending your time in a session. At least you had some sense of what it is you were going to gain out of the session. So this slide sort of speaks to itself in terms of the questions. Hopefully today you'll walk out of here having a better sense of insights into how to think about quality of changing healthcare landscape, developing strategies to invest in systems and to measure and manage quality, understanding interplay of quality and economic performance. As far as the slides, they're really there for 2 reasons. Oftentimes they're PowerPoints with bullet points where people just read them. The slide deck is here for 2 reasons: to offer you a little bit of visual alternative to express or reemphasize some of the points we're trying to make. But the real practical reason is NIC requires all of these panels to have slide decks. I think this one probably would have been best done without one. So don't let it be a distraction, but I'm just doing what I'm told. What I'd like to do is just start off with a couple of thoughts, and then I'm going to start in with the questions. And there's supposedly a gentleman, Tim, who has a microphone, and when we get through a question, I would ask people not to be bashful about raising their hand, asking follow-up questions. Like I said, we do not have answers. We have points of view. You have points of view too, so I think we can learn from each other today. And if it works, NIC is running a similar session around quality as it relates to senior housing. And there's a little bit of an experiment. If it gets good reaction from the audience and attendees, it may be sort of an ongoing session they do every year with obviously an evolution of the discussion. It may not be the 3 of us. I would just, as a preamble, like to tell you that the whole genesis of this discussion came about because I really believe in where we're going with healthcare, post-acute and long-term care, is what I call an industrialized version of what used to be a highly fragmented mom-and-pop business. I think all of you who are in the sector can feel it. It's getting more complicated. It's getting more industrialized. And it's not an accident. I think it's by and large driven by healthcare and by and large thoughtful healthcare policy at the federal and state levels. Market forces that are emerging, which are new and somewhat foreign to healthcare providers, are going to insist on what I call high quality. There's always been a notion of quality in long-term care, but it's always been a little bit twisted because it was more about what you didn't do wrong. You'd have an annual survey, and nobody would ever tell you, but for the recent 5-star system evolution, they never told you what you really did right. They would always tell you what you did wrong, and if you didn't do anything wrong, you were deemed a high-quality operator. But again, there was no real correlation. The marketplace didn't reward you for it. They just didn't penalize you for it. I think that day is going away, which is why I wanted to moderate this panel. And in that thesis, I want these guys to help us understand what you guys should start thinking about as investors, as operators, as to how to come up with game plans in order to prepare yourself for that new day and age. First thing I would say, as we jump into the questions, is what does quality even mean? Because I think, as we would all agree, we use it in different contexts. It means different things in different contexts. But here, these guys are going to start helping you understand what that term means in the concept of post-acute and long-term care. If I tell people that I want to go to a high-quality hotel, everybody thinks of Ritz-Carlton's, Gaylord, Four Seasons. But if I told you the quality that I was looking for was extended stay and low cost, I would tell you that the Four Seasons is not a high-quality hotel because it doesn't have the qualities that I'm looking for. And I think a similar challenge exists before us in the long-term care and post-acute space. So with that, I'm going to address the first question to Dr. Gifford. David, the industry is going through a period of rapid change, and some of these changes are being brought about by policy shift, market demand shift, and sizable demographic shift. Can you help us understand a bit what forces are at work today versus those in decades past, and how those forces are shifting the quality discussion? And as we had talked about, I think it would be great if you could give some historical context about how those quality indicators have shifted over time from policy perspective?
Well, I think at a very high level, historically, the public has trusted their healthcare provider to do the right thing, whether it be a physician or a hospital or SNF or whatever it might be. And in my sort of practice and just personal experience, and probably everyone in the room, either personally has had an experience with a healthcare system or a family member or close friend, and while they might have had a really good outcome, many of them have had bad outcomes, and the experience has been often really not what they would expect in any way or form. And then at the same time, as that experience, I think, has declined, the reimbursement system that's been a volume-based reimbursement system has incentivized more and more care without any accountability on it. And so you have the payers, whether it's the federal government or commercial payers, and business really concerned about the rising healthcare costs, and it's really affecting the economy. And so I think you have the confluence of those two things that have allowed now both commercial payers and the government to start saying, no, we need better value for what we're paying. Now, what I found is that in that value statement, there are two hidden agendas. One value is, I'm going to pay you $100. I'm going to still pay you $100, but I want to make sure I get good value for it. The other is, $100 is too much. I'm going to cut that, and I'm going to do it under the guise of saying you're not doing good quality, so you don't deserve as much. And so there's sort of two aspects. And when you look at a lot of the quality issues that are going on out there, they've been along those. So for me, right now under the quality, everything's around rehospitalization. And that's really the Willie Sutton hypothesis there. And yeah, the slide that's there is because, if you wanted to control costs, you have to decrease hospital use. And so you have quality stuff that's driven around that. So there's a lot of improved quality that is not going to save money. But most of what's driving is saving money. So you want to pick measures that are there. From a clinician standpoint, when elderly go to the hospital, whether they're coming from a SNF or assisted living or home, they come back in a worse condition than they were before. They are more debilitated, often have a delirium, may have antipsychotic added for the delirium. And so 1 in 5 are going to a SNF. And of those, 1 in 5 are going back to the hospital during the stay. And each one of those is costing $12,000. So the fact that hospitalization and rehosspitalization has been a bad quality indicator for a long time, no one's really focused on it until they really had to cut costs. But it's a win-win, so I'm okay with that aspect of it out there. And so I think what you'll see is within all these new payment reforms and everything, at the center of it are usually quality indicators that are going to be related to decreasing utilization of healthcare services in some form or another. Which I think is a little disappointing because you also want to have some indicators in there that just say, for the $100 I pay you, I want better value.
Is that another way of saying we're just lowering our standards?
No, I don't think we're lowering our standards. I think to me, actually, it's a very exciting time from someone who's been devoting to quality a long time because you can't really get people to pay attention to quality until it's linked to payment. Yep. It's literally like what was the movie Up, where the dogs had the little speaker on there, and you could all be in the room, we could be talking about quality, and everyone's really excited, and someone says squirrel, and all the dogs run to the squirrel. You say payment, and everyone runs out the door. And so now that the two are linked, I think it's really an exciting time.
To the earlier point I made, and David, I'd love your point of view, once you introduce market forces into this space, which is starting to emerge, it's amazing how innovative people can become around efficiency in providing the desired outcomes for less or the same amount of money.
It's interesting, the approach in this country is when things don't go well, we get frustrated and we regulate it. And then it doesn't get better, so we regulate a bit more, and then we regulate a bit more. And that's, I think, the nursing home setting has been a poster child of it. I used to run the state survey agency, and so I believe in regulation, but that is not the primary tool to change behavior. Right. You change these payment things, and we see changes within 3 months. and it's wholesale across the board. And what's going to be interesting is we shift payment from volume to value, you're going to see the OIG reports turn overnight from people doing too much care to they're not doing enough care.
If anybody wants to jump in or anything, the one thing I probably should have said, and I'm not sure it was obvious or not, but the selection of these two folks to help me moderate this panel, if you will, was not an accident, because David Gifford comes at this from a policy and regulatory perspective, and the conversation with David around quality is going to look like a policy discussion, intended outcomes. David Stordy, on the other hand, is a career operator, was the president of Golden Living, now the chief operating officer of Mainstreet, and the quality discussion, appropriately so, is going to feel different because a lot of the quality discussion is going to be between operator and consumer or patient as opposed to payer and provider. And we're going to get into more of that later, but I think it's one of the long-term bugaboos of healthcare is that the market doesn't really clear like it ought to clear because it's a tri-party arrangement. If anybody wants to jump in, just raise their hand. Otherwise, I'm going to go on. I don't know if there's anything here you want to jump in on, or we could just skip through them. Question to David Stordy. As a career operator, you've held positions in well-recognized companies, Golden Living, the former Beverly Enterprises, David was the president of, now the chief operating officer of what I would describe as one of the most cutting-edge development companies in long-term care. I don't know if any of you watch Squawk Box in the morning, but I couldn't help but noticing that it was the first time ever that maybe ever on TV, but that I saw an ad for a nursing home, long-term care, skilled nursing company this morning on Squawk Box, and it was Mainstreet. And I asked David, I said, was that a local feed to inspire the folks who are at NIC? And he said, no, it was a national ad, which I thought was really a game changer in my mind because you're looking at this thing very differently than anybody has in the past. To that point, what's different today than 20 years ago? And to your point, being in Mainstreet, being an innovator, what's driving the purchasing decisions? And how are those decision makers changing the dialogue on quality? And then what really matters and to whom?
Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. First off, thanks for the comments on seeing our national ad that we just launched about a week ago. Real excited about having the opportunity to do that. To the original point of this session, when we're talking about quality, and we probably speaking to the choir if all of you are attending this, but absolutely, those of you in the room have probably always prioritized quality. There is no question that this trend towards prioritizing quality, consumers, patients, guests at the center of the whole equation is only going to intensify. It's good for society, and for us at Mainstreet, it's in line with our mission, which is to transform lives and to play our part in getting better and inspiring others to do the same. With the last 25 years has just really been an incredible journey for those of you that have been on it. About 20 years ago, we were wrestling with the implementation of going from cost-based Medicare to PPS. And I remember trying to figure out what a resource utilization group was and what's a ADR and ARD and reference dates and everything that went along with that. And really, here we are, 20 years later, as we move to the prospective payment system, and the sector has, in many regards, it's been challenging, but it's thrived. And now we find ourselves in the next level of our evolution, taking that on. Larger context to the post-acute sector, we are seeing fewer SNFs, and that's going to be a trend that we only expect will continue, although it will be market and geographically isolated. But the larger post-acute sector has continued to expand and evolve over the last 20 years as well. We see LTACs, which really didn't exist until the 1990s. And the LTACs first came about because nursing homes weren't in a place or weren't positioned to take the acuity that we're now taking and only going to take in increasingly more fashion. But LTACs were about 100 in the 1990s, and now we have about 430 LTACs. Different markets. Clearly, we've got the IRFs, we've got home health and hospice, we have outpatient services, and we are seeing, while SNFs, the number of SNFs in the United States are declining, we're seeing an increased trend towards specialization and segmentation on those. memory care residential, and then on the front end where we specialize at Mainstreet, working with our operating clients on the short stay transitional care piece. No doubt the last 5 years we're all wrestling with the Affordable Care Act and what's happening there with payment reform, the influence of consumerism, and which is a great benefit has been the influx of capital investment into the space. It has really helped this sector, this profession, get dollars needed to be strategic, to invest in health information technology, and to find new ways to take on these challenges that are being largely driven from public policy, but are in line with really good service delivery. There is a bit of Darwinism going on here, that it is survival of the fittest. And the big question is many people want to know, will I be one of the survivors? And we will be around. And it won't be just about survival. It will be about those that are really competitive, ready to go, and want to thrive in this. And so what are operators doing now with respects to payment? You're seeing this. You probably have your own stories, and we hope that you share them. But we saw that operators are starting to think more like payers, and they're getting out in front of this. Kindred last year announced that they're a strategic partner and part owner in an accountable care organization in Las Vegas. Just about a month or so ago, we saw Signature Healthcare out of Louisville announce that they have launched their Signature Advantage insurance program, where they're going at full risk for patients in their system for a monthly payment. So those are just two examples. They happen to be in Louisville. Louisville just really seems to be emerging as a center of healthcare innovation. In about 2 weeks, they're going to be hosting a healthcare innovation symposium that will have about 500 executives and leaders and entrepreneurs from around the country that are discussing innovation in healthcare. So just some really great things that are happening there. As operators continue to figure it out, we have to call it what it is and face it on head on as people are. I mean, this is about constricting payment. And we're seeing this. It's very well documented that Medicare spending per beneficiary is decreasing. And that is the desired outcome. And so this trend is only going to continue to accelerate. And as Dr. Gifford spoke about, having the quality, the value tied to payment, tied to those outcomes.
But David, in your case, your organization is very focused in part in building a better mousetrap, beyond the payment mechanism, right? And we'll get into this a little bit more later, but there's an element to that quality that transcends what I call payment and regulation. You're trying to play a market, for lack of a better word, as an investor, I look at somebody like Mainstreet, please take it as a compliment because I think you're doing a great job with it. You're trying to play a market share game too, right? Not just a payment and quality and key indicator game. Because a lot of the folks who will be attracted to that building don't really speak the language that David's speaking.
That's right. Right. And as I said previously, I mean, our target audience, connecting and developing strategic partnerships with operating clients that see the future, the segmentation of right now, the SNF sector, moving into that higher acuity, which has been a journey that SNFs have been on, short stay transitional care, perhaps with its own level of certification or even licensure into the future. Following that trend that's happening nationally of the waterfall of acuity, that's higher quality being delivered in lower cost settings.
I think, the trend is to move to some sort of global bundle payment, and really the transitions of care in healthcare have been abysmal. And so there really is a push to rate accountability to force the different providers to work closer together and to partner. And so how they have that integrated. The integrated doesn't have to be all within one system. And I think controlling the dollars, there's just a ton of money in healthcare. And so if you can carve out health insurance and all their overhead costs and everything, you can control the money. You also can get rid of a lot of these bizarre payment rules and everything else, and then focus better on quality. You can also just withhold care. And so I think you're going to see some sort of accountability to make sure you're not withholding care and getting something for that money, because we went through that in the capitation era back in the 80s and 90s.
And that was the political fears we heard back during the lobbying around the Affordable Care Act, what people used to call death panels. Are people going to make government?
Right.
And I always say to people, if you're worried about the government making a decision about your life, right now the insurance companies do. So pick your poison. For those of you who came in late, one of the things we had mentioned earlier is there is a gentleman, if anybody wants to raise their hand and ask questions during the course of the Q&A. Time allowing, we're happy to take questions at the end, but we wanted really this to be interactive, so if anybody wants to do a follow-up, just jump in. Back to David again. I hate this term, but I didn't coin it, this big data era we're living in. How are you and folks like you thinking about determining qualities that matter to whom, but how do you go about capturing the information? If I'm an investor, I am an investor. So, I talk to operators like you, and I've got to make investment decisions. And you can go to NIC or the American Healthcare Association conference, and you can learn a bunch of acronyms and buzzwords. Yeah. But to drill down, if I'm a little bit newer to the space, how do I know that you're providing a product and service that has the desired outcomes Dr. Gifford's talking about? What, as the certain constituents are desiring, are there off-the-shelf tools that a smaller operator can purchase? Or are we so embryonic in this whole discussion that anything that you're seeing being developed by your constituents or others is all operator by operator? What should an investor look for?
Yeah, I think obviously working very closely with data, big data if you want to call it, evidence-based outcomes is clearly a buzzword, but it is in play, and it's been actively evolving over the last handful of years, and it will only accelerate. I mean, we know that hospitals are under tremendous pressure with the penalties that they're facing for their own hospital value-based purchasing, their readmission penalties, about 720 hospitals, $375 million in penalties, and that's only set to go up. They have hospital-acquired conditions that they're tracking, and then the meaningful use implementation penalties that they're facing. So they're, for once, really looking to partner with post-acute providers. And part of doing that, in recognizing hospitals are ahead of us and managed care companies with data, but there are some great strides being made within the post-acute space. I think that there are some really good products that exist now that are evolving with the times and are delivering and creating newer versions. But there's also, related to the amount of money that's coming into the sector, new products. Health information technology is really exploding. And operators don't have to go it alone. There's a fantastic organization. I just want to know by show of hands, has anyone heard of, or is anyone involved with the LTPAC-HIT, Long-Term Post-Acute Care Health Information Technology Collaborative? Yeah, I mean, they're fantastic. They've been around about 10 years, and they're government providers, they're technology people, all the major associations that affiliate with healthcare have been endorsed sponsors. This is their 10th year. Every 2 years, they lay out a roadmap around health information technology that's available free, and the fifth version just came out a few months ago. They talk about business imperatives and health information and transitions of care. So it's really a great resource if you're not, you either want to validate your strategy in your planning, or you want to link in with people and take advantage of some of the good work that they've already done.
When it comes to things like hospital rehospitalization rates, which David Gifford had mentioned before, when I speak with operators that I'm vetting, some of the discussions you have almost start to feel a little bit hollow. And what I'd like to see as an investor is, are there data sets that are important to that investor, even if they're not yet important to a federal payment system or regulator, because that operator has conviction that sooner or later the market will pay them for a mode of doing business, a cost efficiency that hasn't yet arrived. We tend to be an industry of operators who tend to be very reactive.
Right.
And I don't know if, again, you're an exception to the rule here because you're doing something that other people aren't, beyond advertising on CNBC. So,
well, there is going to be network consolidation.
It's happening now.
If you, hospitals are going to start creating their networks. You've got these post-acute management companies that are creating networks for referrals and discharges. You're going to see a consolidation of the post-acute, and with that, they're going to want to see decreased length of stay and increased discharge to community. And you can make up for the decreased length of stay if you're in a network and keeping your occupancy up. So that's why you're going to see that happen. And higher volume and the collaboration is going to work. So I think you're going to see its divide of at least the nursing home side from really much more concentrated in post-acute rehab care, and then those who are doing long-term dementia care, because the assisted living and the home and community service waiver activity is going to take care of a lot of the rest. And then the challenge is you've got this hub and spoke model of operator design and the capital investment to change that, because the consumers aren't going to tolerate that in the future.
So not only do I agree with you, I would tell you that I don't even think you need to be talking about future tense here.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we're, as a healthcare REIT investor, we are sort of an active player in that consolidation story. It is palpable when we look at the roster of operators. We have 82 different operators from the country in those 900-odd buildings. The profile of those operators today looks so radically different than it did 10 years ago, with some of the characteristics and qualities that you're describing. So we're talking about the next tier, but I think the marketplace, the capital markets in particular, and the more sophisticated operators are getting ahead of that trend in making it happen. And I think the smart, and I hate to use the word less sophisticated, but there's a cadre of operators out there who sort of know what they don't. They know that it's going to get too complicated for them, and we're already seeing folks exit out of the space and consolidate their facilities into larger players.
I do want to come back to something on the big data and the data side. I see a lot, sometimes over-reliance on it's how you use the data, right, and how you use the technology, I should say. And the data doesn't always tell the full picture, but you need to use it. One reason I was gravitated to geriatrics early on, and this also goes to the technology piece you're talking about, is that what I liked about geriatrics was it really focused us sort of on the person, their function, their goals, and you could have huge impacts on individuals without a lot of these high-tech surgery, technology, and stuff. And the goal was to sort of limit the amount of drugs people were on, make sure they weren't falling at home, and do the simple things at home. And so I think back to when I see how people use the technology, and I'm looking at it, is if you're using technology to solve the problem, technology won't solve the problem. Technology can be a tool to help you solve the problem. So when you mentioned sort of EMR and the HIT group, you saw this with the physicians out there. EMRs could be an incredibly powerful tool to transform healthcare delivery if you use it within a broader context. What we saw with most EMRs and physicians is they digitized the highly inefficient, disorganized medical records. And so now they just have it really faster, inefficient medical records in digitized form instead of paper form. And it really was, they're slowly changing with EMR. You have some pocketed providers out there who are figuring out how to use it differently. But there are a number of providers with EMRs. They can't do the analyses. I was really struck when we've done some stuff with SNFs where we give them information on who are their high-risk individuals for pick whatever condition, and they're like, well, this is the greatest thing. And we're like, well, we just got it off your MDS. They're not even using their MDS to figure out who's at high risk for pressure ulcers, who's not at high risk for pressure ulcers, and they're treating everyone the exact same way. That's just a very inefficient, disorganized provider as you go forward on. So I think there are ways to think about that and how to use the data out there.
Go ahead.
No, you.
I was just going to hop in. Related to LT-PAC HIT.
But that acronym is actually longer than the name.
Yes, I know, it's difficult. But they, in addition to all the good work they do, they're constantly or on a frequent basis sourcing post-acute providers. And they've done some outreach, some surveys, and I just want to have a little bit of data, so bear with me. But, the last survey they did was in late 2014. And they surveyed 500 post-acute organizations. So that's pretty good size. Around technology adoption. About 2/3, 63% of all post-acute providers report that they don't have or aren't fully using information systems technology and information data exchanges. This survey pulled out some disparities between really large companies and really small companies that perhaps anecdotally validate what some of us think, but 89% of the respondents from single or standalone nursing homes and SNFs reported having no money budgeted for 2014, and this was at the end of the year, for IT projects. But 84% of the large SNF and post-acute providers had funds allocated for that. Needs for technical help. Only 5% of small chains say that they can develop and implement IT solutions without the help of vendors. But yet 43% of the CEOs of those organizations said they didn't have plans to bring in an outsourced vendor. New payment models. The same 63 or two-thirds that aren't fully embracing and implementing, they expect that 52% of them that their patient mix is going to change to an alternative payment model, ACO or otherwise, in the next 2 years. So they're seeing it, and then, about half of the respondents expect to be acquired. This was really interesting. About half of the respondents of these 500 organizations expect to be acquired by a more technology superior organization in the future. So just clearly good information to get insights as you start to, as we all consider our use of big data. And to your point, David, it really is. It's like art. It's in the eye of the beholder. And the interpretation of what that art and what that data is showing you, turning it into meaningful information is critically important as the last stage to not just overlaying technology onto not as clearly defined operations as they need to be in the cases where that exists.
Well, I was going to go back to the slide here. So you said something that made me think about it. But, as you were saying, who you should pick and using big data, this is data on all 15,000 nursing homes in the country and their 30-day rehospitalization rate. There's going to be a 2% withhold that you can earn back based on your rehospitalization rate. Yeah. And basically, it's going to be, if you're in the bottom 40, 50%, you are probably going to lose 2%. So if you look at that graph, essentially, if your risk-adjusted rate's over 15%, you're really at risk. If you're over 20%, it's going to be very hard to make that up because everyone else is getting better. You have to really be a good organization to make that up. And so pretty much everyone that you see from the 4 columns there over, they're going to lose 2%. And, right now, everyone argues every year what their market basket rate increase is, which is 1.5%. And so you also talk about, what's the focus on quality and are people really ready for it and everything? What I noticed is, as this bill went through and as people were talking about it, there was disproportionate amount of discussion and emphasis on and arguments with CMS on the market basket rate increase as to whether it should be 1.6 or 1.7. Now, I don't mean to minimize the fact that 0.1 is still a lot of money and it will impact a lot of businesses out there, and it's something that has historically been done. There was almost no discussion about 2% cut in their rates, which is more than the 1.5% market basket rate increase. Almost none. Yeah. And, I'm like, and they pay attention, and then someone say, well, market basket rate increase, and they'd all run out the room to the market basket rate increase discussion. And I'd be like, but that's 1.5%. I got 2% here.
So I would draw a distinction when it comes to quality efficiency, which is part of the story, between data and technology. Anecdotally, I have a brother who's a neonatologist, and about once every year or so, he'll ask me to come and walk through his NICU. And we've been doing this for about 25 years. And I am always blown away, for lack of a better word, by every 2 or 3 years. The place looks completely different from a technological standpoint. The modes of care, labor is being displaced by technology. Yeah. And my brother's not a businessman, but he says to me, we can't afford the labor component anymore. So innovation has come in and made it a reality. The optimist in me says that as we respond as an industry, we haven't yet seen what I call the true innovation wave yet. You walk through a skilled nursing facility today, in the basic modality of care, while the reimbursement's changing, the qualities are changing, but it pretty much looks like it did beyond the paint and paper, like it did years ago in terms of the labor component in delivering that quality. Right. And I think that will change. I think it's going to need to change for us to sort of meet the practical realities that are facing us demographically. But capital is a wonderful idea accelerator. How many of you in the room are operators? So the next question, which is directed at David Gifford, is really directed toward his point of view of where the operator's mindset are right now. And I think if you're an investor, I think it's a very important question. If you're an operator and you think one of us is offending, don't be bashful. But when you listen to the chatter on the street in the halls of NIC here, do you feel that the providers are in tune with the policy matters? Do you really think they get it?
Well, it's like with anything. It's some do and some don't. I mean, I think my private example is that. You know, there's a lot of people who are focusing on the 1.5% market basket rate and not considering this other broader change. But I also think people know that these big changes are coming. But from an operator, you're also so overwhelmed with the day-to-day things that are going on, the survey that's coming in, the managed care company that's calling you for a contract, your high turnover and your labor costs, and trying to figure out how to deal with that this almost all seems just too big, and I'm just going to, you know, it's out of my control, so I'm just going to do what I can out there. I think the other thing is I see some people feeling some things are really out of their control. To me, if I'm looking at big data and really sign of an organization, I mean, if you think about, you look at high-performing organizations in and out of healthcare, there's some very common themes that you see across there. And how your labor force works and treats is a big one. And, you know, we've made as one of our quality initiatives to look at turnover and retention. And it's the one that we can't get anyone to focus on. Frankly, it's the most important one out there. It's what I would look at when I go in. I mean, when I go into a building, whether I was in survey or anything, one of the first things I look for is, how does the staff respond and refer to the organization? They refer to it in the third person plural. Yep. This organization is in deep trouble. There's deep trouble. And I can pretty much predict I'm going to see all sorts of problems and high turnover. And if you go in and they start referring to it in the first person plural, you know, we and us versus they and them, you know, you have a different organization. Things will flow from that. So to me, that's a very simple, early distinguishing. And what I don't see is people seem so overwhelmed they don't think they can control that, because we don't have a lot of training in it. And so a lot of the operators think this is all about clinical practice. When you look at rehospitalization, the Interact program is not much about clinical practice. It's about communicating with the hospital, communicating between nurses and physicians, communicating between the aides and the nurses, and, you know, then let the professional clinical stuff flow from that. Yet we want to have the technology for how to do heart failure, pneumonia, and everything else. So that's where I see a disconnect with the operators and what's going on. But I think people see this stuff's coming, but there's so much coming at them, they're just overwhelmed and throwing up their hands.
You know, I had a red flag, and I've had it for years. It's much less scientific than that, but when I go into a facility, if they're describing the number of executive directors they've had per year, rather than the number or the years the executive director has had tenure, I really sort of have pause about the quality of the operator. Back to your labor retention issue.
Yeah. We're measuring, and everyone can submit their data and track their turnover and benchmark, and we've had only 1,000 of the 10,000 members submit the data.
Wow. One of the things I want to mention, well, this was meant to be a little humorous, and David, you and I talked about this early on. This issue of this transitional phase we're going through right now, where if you walk into virtually not all, post-acute long-term care facilities in this country, there's really a dueling business model going on. We're having a conversation around quality, but most of the discussion, not all, is really around this notion of how to satisfy the post-acute constituents, how they're getting paid for it, what matters to both the patient and the payer. But the reality is a lot of the folks, the majority of the folks in these buildings by ADC, average daily census, are still Medicaid, long-term care Medicaid recipients. And I think that tension, where if you're an operator, you've got to manage to almost two different quality sets. Superficially, the way we see it manifest itself is you've got buildings where there's a Medicare unit. Somebody will reinvest in the real estate. They're not going to put money into the Medicaid unit. They're going to put money into the Medicare unit. And now, for the first time, we're starting to see operators come to us and say, hey, we've got to think about that Medicaid unit because market share is imperative even in that sector. That's a demanding customer, and you can't take it for granted. So it's some interesting transition going on, but I think this issue doesn't get enough discussion because it's really almost two separate quality discussions.
Yep.
You have a question here.
I don't know if you want to, Tim? You have a question up in the front? What's that? Yeah, because the other people will hear you.
I'm so glad you mentioned employee turnover, because I think it is a very big indicator of quality, and I think a lot of providers can be broken into short-term decision makers or long-term decision makers, because investing in reducing your employee turnover is a long-term decision. You're not going to solve that problem tomorrow. If I'm worried about busting a financial covenant or making my quarterly earnings for next quarter, chances are I'm not making those investments and reducing my employee turnover. So I guess what I was hoping you guys can discuss a little bit is what impact do those factors have on quality, especially as it relates to labor. If I'm investing in my labor, I get returns, but I might not see them for a year. I wonder what you guys thought about that.
I'm going to jump in, and I might be the least qualified, but I can tell you how we see it when it comes to labor turnover. It's in margins. And it's margins, and it's in survey data. Whenever I think we would all agree that at least nationally we're in a reasonably accommodating labor market. But just the other day, we're going through our portfolio, which we do once a quarter, and periodically you'll hear somebody say they're using, okay, somebody cheated. They're using agency labor. Well, is that a market where there's labor shortfall? No. That operator can't, for whatever reason, attract labor force. It's a direct hit beyond what I call any quality that the payor or the consumer, the patient, would ever recognize. The economic harm that does is real and immediate and long-term. I don't know if you guys want to.
No, I think the question is similar to the question that you posed to David Gifford about policymakers. Do people get it? And, I think intellectually they probably get it, but in their roles, it's really not their job to get it. So practically speaking, that's the quality trap. That's the tension of the operator. The story of the three little bears, right? That the porridge has to be just right, can't be too hot and too cold. And I do think, not to overly come back to the data, but that is really important part of framing up what your plan is and advocating for your operations and being able to tell that story about what it costs to run your business. And to tell the good story about the things that you have implemented and the efficiencies and the trends in the right direction. At least in my experience and some of my colleagues, I have worked with REITs and other investor groups that have been appropriately compassionate in the framework of a strategic partnership around understanding what the plan is and if there's credibility and confidence around what the needs are. For example, another trend we're seeing across the United States is the increase in the minimum wage. Well, these minimum wage pressures are growing considerably, and that's our largest operating expense, is the labor piece.
You just read my mind. I was just going to say something about minimum wage, because if I'm a long-term decision maker, I might bump my nurses' aides wage rate to stay competitive with the McDonald's down the street. That's now paying almost as much as my nurses' aides are. Yeah. So as a long-term decision maker, I'm adjusting my wage rates to combat against those big increases in minimum wage, because that is an impact in the markets that I operate in. And I think some people are going to be compromised in making that type of long-term decisions, again, if they're worried about debt service coverage and making quarterly earnings.
Yeah, there's definitely multiple forces that are converging. Yeah. We look at the formation of these post-acute networks that Dr. Gifford was speaking about, and Stephen in the beginning was talking about the free market dynamics that are at play with these changes, which are absolutely part of constricting post-acute spending. They're trying to force competitive pricing, and in forcing competitive pricing, if you really don't understand what the cost is to operate, and many SNF operators don't, although many, many more are getting much better at it as they are investing in technology. As a sector, we've lagged behind other adoptions of technology, but you can go and advocate for those operations. I was speaking with one of our operators who's phenomenal, based up out of the Chicago area just recently, And he was telling me a story about how one of his payer sources wanted to drop really a short-stay transitional care rate, $400 all-inclusive. And they have a long-term relationship, and he went back and told his story with data, including the wage pressures. And long story short, they went to a RUGS-based modified rate that's going to give him some breathing room into the future, but they've developed that joint operating committee and that collaborative relationship around talking strategically about the operations and in a context to show how it benefits their members.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of forces, as you point out, that are short-term. You have payment systems, you have earnings, you have goals, you have thin margins that really require you to do short-term changes. When we've all had budget issues at some point in our career, where halfway through our budget cycle, someone says, "Well, we have to tighten the budget within this budget cycle." Well, in a 6-month period, there's only a few things you can do to adjust your budget, and they're often not the right long-term things. And the long-term things take 1 or 2 years to invest, so you never get out of that cycle. So you see a lot of states that are in these structural deficits, because states are always on one-year budget cycles, and they never actually can get anything out of it. So you have that issue. You have the survey regulatory process that requires you to fix things fast. But even in their own pilot with how to implement QAPI, an integrated management system, it took 12 months. Well, 12 months, you don't have 12 months to fix anything. So that just takes that off the table. It's the right thing to do. I think what we've seen, to your point, is the data shows pretty clearly a correlation between turnover and quality. Turnover of direct care staff, turnover of administrators. Research data has shown that pretty much the goal is turnover should be between 20 and 40. Once you get over 40, it takes off. And the other belief is that turnover is tied to salary. And the data shows it's really not tied to salary. It's really tied to the management and operations and the broader healthcare delivery system. But those take time to implement. Those members who have pursued the Baldrige framework that we have and then we recognize, they all have low turnover. The cost of turnover is huge, not just in the direct cost of staffing issues, but the more likely you get deficiencies. Each deficiency you get has a huge cost. The impact on your quality and your network has a huge cost. Data has shown that the turnover is a stronger predictor of quality than actual staffing levels out there when you put both in the model. So I think to me it's really an important thing, but there's so many influences that are saying, in one sense, it surprises me that many people are focusing on it. In another sense, it doesn't surprise me at all, because the system isn't set up to allow people to focus on that.
Well, it's interesting, even in our conversation today, we didn't think of the labor force as being one of the constituents in the quality measures. But to share with you an anecdote, when I was an operator back in the late 90s when labor markets were very hot, I was based in the Boston area. I was involved with the American Healthcare Association's local chapter. It was at a trade association meeting, and we were all complaining that we couldn't find labor. And there was a speaker who came in who was a sort of a labor coach, or inspirational speaker. And she said, does everybody here have labor problems? Everybody's hand went up, and she said, and everybody's like, we can't find labor. And she pointed to one individual, and he goes, well, how many buildings are in your marketplace? And he goes, 6 or 7. He goes, well, there's plenty of people working in that marketplace. The problem is they don't want to work for you. Yeah. And having been an operator, there's this reluctance to rebase your labor force in order to maintain it. But if you think about it, you're going to have to get creative, much in the way you are to gain market share in patient and to covey favor and quality with the payer. You're going to have to figure out creative ways to inspire your labor force to stay with you. And tragically, I think we tend to disregard the labor force. Words like minimum wage, it's a low-cost labor force. You can't disregard it, especially if we get into a marketplace where labor becomes much dearer than it is today.
Yes. Yeah, not to sound trite at all, but people are the precursor to high-quality operations. And so while we're talking about a lot of understanding policy and payment models and the objective quantitative measures, all of that, nothing happens obviously without a high level of employee workforce engagement. Culture trumps strategy. There will be no execution without that. So we all sort of the softer side of us as working through operations. It's not only understanding what the larger context is, developing our own plans, but how do you mobilize the workforce and really become very successful change management and change leadership agents?
Well, there's at least one person in the audience, but I won't call anybody out, who is focused on, by profession, in what I call constituent feedback. And it's something that we're very focused on ourselves. To solve a labor problem, you have to at least accept the fact you might have a labor problem. To do that, you actually have to have feedback loops, if you will, what I would call constituent satisfaction feedback, not just customer. And that's a big idea for most operators, but I think as this conversation evolves, as David Gifford said earlier, I think the more money gets tied to this construct, this session will be the more popular one, just like you were saying about the operators responding. Capital will come in and say, oh, I got to understand that. It's not just a subjective concept anymore. Just moving along. This is directed at David Stordy, but again, it's for everybody. As an investor, when I vet an operator, my primary focus is in understanding how the operator's strategy sort of syncs with this triangulation, which most of you are familiar with, and if not, should get familiar with. One of the concerns I always have is what I call it a quality trap, where you're focusing your operations and your environment on a customer base that isn't your payer. And at what point does your customer base, they're never going to say to you it's too much quality, but the payer's not paying you for it. In fact, we're seeing anecdotally where Kaiser in their Medicare Advantage programs now are controlling, rather than in the fee-for-service models where the individual controls the direction of where they go. Kaiser and some of these larger markets are directing where they go, but they're less sensitive to what the building looks like, much more sensitive, obviously, to desired clinical outcomes. Yeah. How do we ought to think about that in terms of positioning, if you're an investor or an operator, positioning appropriately to maximize your returns? Because there could be too much quality, right? If the hotel puts gold leaf on the ceiling, you're not paying more for a room, if you will. But you guys are building some of the highest physical plant quality buildings in the country right now. How do you guys think about it?
Yeah. I think it speaks to the larger trend that's happening nationally around the segmentation within SNF. Some people are embracing it, believe in it. Some people may disagree in it or disagree with it, and it plays out on a market-by-market basis. But generally speaking, by and large, skilled nursing facilities, 15,500 or 200, whatever the number is today, for the most part have been mixed-use healthcare properties. Traditional long-term care, then we evolved into short stay, we got specialized into memory care, and now we're seeing even more segmentation, and that's the space we play in on the short stay transitional care. There are opportunities for long-term care, more residential, this bifurcation that is happening within the senior housing and the post-acute space, but I think the first part, making that longer range decision and putting a strategic plan in place in attempting to forecast your revenue streams around how you want to pivot your operations into the future will allow you to be more focused and more successful in executing. I mean, the markets are changing really, really quickly. I mean, we know that 24%, back 6 years ago, 24% of traditional fee-for-service was in Medicare Advantage, so 76% was traditional fee-for-service. Now that number is 45%. So in 6 years, traditional fee-for-service Medicare has dropped 30%. What are the implications for that? We know now with the bundle payment for care improvement initiative that the 48 of the top DRGs are tied to 70% of the Medicare spending. And 64% of those bundles have to do with cardiac and ortho. And the ones that trail right behind are GI and respiratory and stroke, CVAs. So those are national trends, but how are they playing out in local markets? And how do you develop, or how do we develop clinical programs to be a solution to their problems? And ultimately, that's where the shared risk arrangements, the bundle payment, which is moving very, very quickly right now. About 7% of SNFs nationally are participating in bundle payment care improvement initiative. That's the vast majority under the Model 3. So about 1,000 SNFs are jumping in and understanding this. And so position, and all the while, the markets are changing really rapidly. We've seen integration strategies, Kindred, with its vertical integration of Gentiva, Genesis with the acquisition of Sun Health and Skilled over the last couple years, Omega Aviv on the REIT side, the strategic spinoff of Care Capital Partners from Ventas. Just notably, documented hospitals and health systems are at all-time high transactions. And now we're watching the insurance companies potentially consolidate.
You got the Caremark Omnicare deal. I don't know if you...
Right. So there's a lot that's happening as we're sort of wrestling through what the changes are. How are these more macro changes that are happening and changes that are happening outside of our properties and our company, how do they influence how it trickles down into local marketplace? And I think that that's the way you'll get your more refined strategy by engaging in scenario planning and options of how resources and variables will potentially change to be able to execute, while at the same time you're working really deeply in your business, caring about people, coordinating care, coaching, encouraging people, trying to build that culture.
It depends on the payer, but all of them, Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial, their primary goal is to cut their costs. And technically that's what they're supposed to be working on behalf of the employers or where else to cut their costs. So that is their primary responsibility. And depending on how they're paying and what they're doing is going to be the different strategy. And for Medicaid, the only way they can cut their costs is to get people out or not go to the SNF. There is no way to cut that, or they cut the rates. Because actually better quality has no impact on Medicaid rates. You can have outstanding, almost all the improvements in quality are going to save money to Medicare. So if you make it a dual, game changer. Yep. Now it changes. So while everyone says managed care is going to be the solution for Medicaid, and a lot of places are going that, the only options those managed care have is to cut your rates or deny people to go to the home. And denying really frail elderly from going to the home doesn't really work. Yep. And it has failed in almost every state. So eventually they're going to have to figure out how to cut the rates. There's no, unless they do it as a precursor to go into duals, because all the improvement in quality will decrease drug, lab tests, hospitalization. For Medicare, if it's an MA plan, they're going to want to do the same thing. They're going to decrease length of stay, and they're going to want to decrease rehospitalization. And if they can't get those two things, they're not going to do the savings out there. So, you know, we had a conversation with one of the Kaiser groups the other day. They're willing to partner with a bunch of SNFs and make up the volume, but cut the rate, but they'll keep you fully occupied. And it's almost like they're going to put you on a retainer and buy their beds.
We see that actually emerging in our portfolio. What's remarkable is we see these large penetration Medicare Advantage markets where average length of stays are shrinking, admissions are increasing, there's a velocity of payment, but margins have been remarkably resilient. Yeah. Which I lead to, there's efficiency, there's innovation.
Well, a lot of these also start waiving all these bizarre payment rules and everything else, so you can actually do it, which is, then you allow the innovation to occur. The other thing is, we look at the data, there's only about 2,000 SNFs in the country that are doing the vast majority of all the post-acute care. Then there's a handful of about another 1,500 that are sort of trying to straddle the two and try to get into that club. And then the rest are just the traditional long stay and are making it work. And I think you're just going to see that bifurcation happen further and further because you can't keep it both going.
Can I bring you on my next roadshow?
Yeah.
Because that point has gone lost on Wall Street, that of the 15 or 16,000 odd SNFs in this country.
I'll give you the one table, the one slide. It just shows the volume. It's striking. So when you say 7% are in the bundle payment and it's about 1,000, that's like half the SNFs doing all the Medicare are already in bundle payment in this country.
Right, and we see the public policy saying what alternative payment model implementation will be by 2018. So there's got to be a quick...
I think it's 6,500 of the 15,000 SNFs, almost half, are doing less than 100 admissions a year. All payer.
Well, we see it in our portfolio, which is effectively a proxy for the industry.
Yeah.
So I don't need to be convinced, but part of this is educating the investor community, the operator community, and that's a great segue to the next question, David. In the mid-'90s, I actually saw this slide.
No, I was just looking at the slide.
In the mid-'90s, there was this big land rush that I got sucked into to get all our buildings JACO certified because the managed care marketplace was coming. You were going to engage yourself in contracts. They weren't going to accept non-JACO certified building. Everybody got dressed up for the show, and the show never came, but for a very few buildings. Help the operators and the investors understand, is there a risk to getting into this whole mode of satisfying through data the new quality initiatives? Is there a risk to doing it too quickly because the model itself is still emerging and even the policymakers aren't quite sure? Many of these programs that we kick around, bundle payments, ACOs, a lot of them are still in their infancy and their pilot phases. And as expensive as it is to be late to the show, it can also be more expensive to be too early.
I think you need a good integrated management system in place, and then you can pivot. If you don't have a good, your microphone's off. If you don't have a good management system in place and coordinate and are knowing how you're tracking your system, evaluating your system, and making changes, you're not going to be able to live because it's really hard to predict what's going to happen. And if you're trying to just chase it and figure out this, but if you have that broader system in place, then you can handle all these. If you have a good information system, if you have a good process, if you have good teams, if you have low turnover, and you're able to handle these things and address them in a systematic way, this is why we've been really trying to promote and really ramp up the Baldrige framework. Because we just see those organizations, they can handle this.
Can you give me a little bit of a back when you say the Baldrige framework?
So the Baldrige framework is developed outside of healthcare. It's been applied to healthcare, and it's a framework to evaluate an organization having a good organizational management system in place. How does leadership operate with some of the basic principles of leadership? How do they focus on the different customers? How do they focus on their workforce? How do they use knowledge to incorporate it into the latest practices? How do they use data to drive their changes? And then what type of results do they get? And how do they learn from that and go forward? And so it doesn't prescribe a particular process. It's just you have to have that framework in place. So very much like on this slide here, are you reviewing your performance? Are you analyzing your system? Are you planning your change? You pilot test it. You evaluate it, you revise it, and you disseminate it through your organization. And there's Six Sigma, there's Lean, there's TQM, there's all these different models out there. I don't care which one they are.
Right.
You can have different black belt people and purple belt people and everything else, but as long as you're doing this broader principles, and that's what the Baldrige does, that evaluation. And so, when you're up at the silver or gold level, and we've been running it for 12 years, we only have 20 SNFs in the country have achieved the gold level. It's a high bar, but I could tell you, those places are amazing places, and they are going to make it.
Has there been any correlation between that achievement of quality and economic return?
We've started to look at that, and there's definitely a relationship with the turnover, much higher occupancy, 2 to 3% higher occupancy. We've been working with some of the liability insurance carriers, much lower claims against them. The margins, it's a little tough because the numbers are so small. Some of the data suggests that if they're in a market, the problem is it turns out is if you're in a market where there's other SNFs, they do really well. If you're in a rural area where you're the monopoly, no, it doesn't really help it that much because there is no competition.
Are those names of those successful buildings made publicly available?
We get a call from 2 or 3 REITs every year for the list of the people that are silver and gold winners.
Well, because we do know that the cost report information, although on a time-delayed basis, is available, although NIC, to a plug, is really trying to do a real-time rent and metric initiative in the SNF world right now to really help the investor and the operator correlate those successes to the economics.
And speaking of that, we also have, just so you know, we have one large investment management company getting rehospitalization, length of stay, and discharge community data every quarter from us.
Excellent.
Others can get it too if you want it.
We're almost out of time. There was one last formal question, but in some regards it's a little bit redundant because we've captured it. I want to just share just a couple of things in closing. I want to thank both of you for doing this. I think this is a topic that is lost on the vast majority of people, especially at an investor conference. I think if we were doing this in more of a healthcare venue, it would be more relevant. I think, though, that as time marches on, to the extent these folks are right in their vision of what the next couple of years look like, this will become a meeting for the merely interested to the must understand, what I call crowd, if you will. In all the years, and David Gifford mentioned it before, in all the years I've been in this business, even though some of these things look scary, they look like big challenges, I actually think the industry is really going through a renaissance. We used to sit around with our worry beads and complain about what reimbursement was going to be next year as our primary focus without regard for most other things. I really believe the more market force we bring to the sector, the better the quality, regardless of how we end up defining it, will end up being. Because the market will determine what matters at the end of the day, guided by healthcare and fiscal policy, as you're describing. One of the things, at the risk of a not so gratuitous plug, as you know, David is involved with the American Healthcare Association. We're at NIC. These organizations are critically important from a voice perspective. These things don't just happen because people care. They happen because folks like David make them happen. NIC, as an organization, sometimes it gets lost on people, is a research organization. It is actually starting to initiate a very robust effort around the skilled and post-acute market in terms of key data. They're looking to get about 25% of the for-profit SNFs in the United States to report what I call a series of key metrics on a month-by-month real-time basis. A number of our operators are actually participating because I think that as these conversations go on over the next year or so, being able to link those success stories with actual hard data is what an investor is going to need to do. And I think, I've got this, here it is, this slide. It's the virtuous cycle versus the vicious cycle. You're going to get into this market force. Does we go out of control? Quality suffers because nobody can afford to deliver it? I don't think so. I think we're going to end up in a virtuous cycle. The one thing I always caution everybody, I think this is going to be wonderful for the industry, but it may not be wonderful for everybody in the industry. As you said, David, there will be winners and losers, but I think if you look at the industry overall and the people that matter most, which are the patients, us, taxpayers, the employees, the constituents, I think it's going to be a huge winner. I think the only risk is ignoring the topic altogether, and I think you'll be left behind. But I appreciate everybody coming today and listening. It's a little academic, a little arcane, but I think as some of this stuff takes root, it'll be less so as we be able to sort of tie more closely quality and economic satisfaction. They're applauding me in the next room. They must have piped in my voice. Thank you, everybody.